One. Hello everybody, I'm here today with Joshua Denny and we're going to continue our discussions on Gurdjieff and All and Everything and Beelzebub's towers, and we thought we'd do the subject today of Atlantis. So I'm going to start off with reading from page 110, where Beelzebub's coming down to land for his first descent upon Earth. Thus it was on this ship occasion that I made my first descent to the planet Earth. Our ship landed on this first visit of mine on the shores of just that continent which during the second catastrophe to this planet disappeared entirely from its surface. This continent was called Atlantis, and most of the free-brain beings, and likewise most of the beings of our tribe, then existed only upon it. So Joshua, he lands on Atlantis, where also other beings like himself are also living there amongst these free brain beings that are humans.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, yourself that Atlantis, the idea of it, it's in a lot of different, comes up in a few different teachings. And he does seem to suggest, like throughout the book, that it's always, well, there's quite a lot of references to Atlantis, and they always seem to come in the kind of context that he's always using Atlantis to refer to, like, a time in the past where things used to be different. So he's always kind of refers to change in relation to Atlantis, like says, oh, well, after the time of Atlantis, people no longer were able to do this or that, whereas before, the disappearance of Atlantis, people could do this or that. So he always kind of refers to it in the context of change, and like significant change in terms of people's like possibilities. I mean, he says, doesn't he, I think throughout the book, that in his opinion, like science then and man's knowledge kind of like hit its peak, at that sort of time, the Atlantis civilization, and he kind of suggests that regardless of our sort of technological advancements since then, they don't kind of really match the same sort of peak of what they had back then. And of course there's no kind of, as far as we know, evidence for any like well, you could say concrete evidence for any like advanced technologies, although like in some of the pyramids and some of the the buildings and artifacts that we do have from ancient existence, sometimes they do display kind of a quality of workmanship that we can't quite put our finger on as how they were actually able to do it with the tools that we think they had available to them. So maybe it's possible that the kind of technology that he's referring to is what we would normally think of as technology in terms of external equipment and things like that. But he also seems to suggest that in terms of their sort of inner world, the kind of psyche, their being, that the people of Atlantis were of a much higher order, that their achievements, you could say, in the in the realm of being, in their realm of their psyche and things like that was much higher. So that's there's two kind of senses there of difference, like technological advancement and sort of inner technological advancements in terms of like these inner techniques and different practices of spiritual traditions. But I mean, in terms of like an actual sort of historical like possibility for like a location of Atlantis, so far as I haven't looked into it, all the different theories that go along with it, but one of the more sort of plausible ones that I've came across is in terms of it, the idea of it being in the sort of Mediterranean. I don't know if you've heard about like the Minoan civilization. So that's one of the more sort of interesting sort of leads that I found in terms of an actual possible physical location for this place that disappeared. Because they do have evidence in the Med of obviously significant volcanic activity, and there are underwater remains, and they did find at this like the Minoan civilization in the Med that they do have some of the most advanced technological developments that we found. Like they were one of the first, I think the little remains there have like some early forms of toilets and like guttering and like sewage systems. So they do seem to be some of the earliest kind of advanced civilization that we know of.
A civilized civilization.
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't know much.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I don't think we know much in terms of their behavior and stuff, their what sort of morals, if you like, or beliefs they had. But in terms of at least like the buildings and the sort of physical technology that they had, they do seem to be significantly ahead. Like we don't find instances of that sort of like kind of indoor plumbing and stuff till much later, you know. So
For the Romans.
yeah. So there's like that, you know, there is this idea, like when he, not just Gurdjieff, but other people refer to Atlantis, that like progress, what we normally consider to be progress, isn't just like a straight line, you know. Like Gurdjieff is always talking about things being lost, you know, ideas, like he talks about the law of seven, like heptaparapagog, like I think he says that it's like being repeatedly discovered and lost again throughout time. Like people discover it and think they're like discovering something for the first time that nobody's ever known about. Whereas he says, no, it's just like it's been periodically learned and forgotten and then like learned again, you know. So that's a kind of a different idea of development than we, I think we have in the sort of modern world. You know, we do kind of believe in this idea of like almost like constant progress, or this idea that we are like, you know, we kind of regard ourselves as much more advanced generally as the beings in the past, because we think that there's been this kind of steady, you know, development or progress, not just in terms of like our technology, but also we think in terms of our mind and our, you know, we regard ourselves to be clever when we look at back at the beliefs of people in the past. Most people today, they generally think of them as like silly people, like, oh, how could you believe in like, you know, angels or this or that or superstitions? You know, I would have never have believed in that stuff if I would have been around at those times. You know what I mean? So we tend to
that's the rational mind coming in, isn't it? And that's the problem with the last few centuries, that we've gone to the idea of everything's got to be rational, hasn't it? Which has taken away the belief in other things, of that there's other things going on in this world.
Yeah, and just like this, yeah. I mean, obviously, different things have happened that have conditioned, like, our beliefs. But just that idea does seem to be prevalent throughout history. Like Gurdjieff again kind of refers to it. Like he kind of almost says that any civilization that sort of gained a little bit of a kind of an advancement over the others, you know, was maybe a little bit more ahead, or just happened to be bigger, or, you know, whatever. That they always tended to regard themselves as like, you know, superior, look down on the, you know, the cultures around them or the cultures in the past. So each generation is like assuming it's, you know, so much more advanced than you could say than the ones in the past. And it's kind of like the teenager, you know, again, the kind of the stereotype of the teenager, isn't it? As soon as your kid becomes a teenager, he knows everything. You know, the parents can't tell him what's what, because you know, you think you know better than
Yep, I remember them days.
yeah.
I was such an
so
idiot.
You know, so like he kind of refers to that as a recurring theme in like civilizations, or just our psyche, that we're often, you know, consider ourselves, you know, to be the best or the most intelligent, and that there has been this kind of like, you know, kind of linear progression in terms of development of intelligence or even technologies. So you know, he might be using the idea of Atlantis as one way to kind of express that idea, you know, that there hasn't been like this kind of linear development, that development in its nature is not linear. Like his very idea of kind of the law of seven and the octave, it kind of expresses this, that development isn't, you know, like a straight line, you know, that there are these points in it, and it's not really a kind of a linear process. There's like in the Enneagram, there's a mixture of different kind of processes. Like there's the process around the outside, like numerically say from 1 to 9, that's kind of like linear time. But then you've also got that sort of non-linear figure, you know, the hexad inside the hexagon that goes from like 1, 4, 2, 5, 8, 7, whatever. So, you know, that kind of expresses a different order of time, and these, or, you know, temporality, and that these different processes are all involved in development, and that this development is not guaranteed unless, like, of course, there's the shocks and things like that. So I think at least in one way why he uses or refers to Atlantis is to try to, you know, ridicule or destroy, you know, like Beelzebub is supposed to be for like destroying some of our beliefs, this idea about linear progress, you know, and also the very nature of how progress or development is achieved, you know.
Because I always thought that Gurdjieff was actually trying, like exactly what you're saying of what he's writing. We're actually de-evolving. We've come from a time, in the ancient times, there was a golden age that obviously they understood how to build pyramids and whatever else they were doing. He says that they used electricity in a way different to how we used it. And hopefully we're going to do a show on electricity one day soon. So it's like we've gone backwards, but obviously in today's world, no one wants to admit that, do they? That we're the fools. We want to be the people that are going forward with humanity and making us some great civilization.
Yeah, and also this I mean, it's a typical, like in our psychology, that we like to like feel safe and things. So I suppose we like this idea that progress is like, consistently developing, that things are being retained and built upon, so we like that idea. It's kind of comforting. And of course, yes, there could be a natural resistance to the idea that, that things that might not be developing linear, or that there is this real potential for loss. Again, like a lot of the ideas in Beelzebub, they talk about the need for people to preserve knowledge and wisdom, because there is this real chance for it to be lost, or like he does say, things have been lost. So his kind of view of, you could say, like, the nature of man, or you could even say creation, is hazardous. Things aren't always guaranteed, and there can be real sort of gains and real losses. So I think he presents a different idea to some of the other traditions, which kind of look at creation as like a zero, like a zero sum game. They say that everything kind of balances out, and that there isn't really any actual development or real change or real loss, and gain. So I think he kind of expresses a different idea, a different idea to the universe or creation, that there can actually be real loss and gain. So it kind of gives a different value to like manifestation, like in the Eastern traditions have the idea of like Maya or Maya, illusion and stuff. So, ideas have come about through that manifestation is illusory or doesn't have any like, real value or real worth. And that kind of ties into that idea that there can't be any real development in the world of Maya then, Whereas I think, he tries to emphasize a different sort of view on that there is a reality to, existence on the manifest side. And that
he wants to try and make us see past Maya, doesn't he? Because Maya is part of the, like you're saying, the illusion. And we've got to look at the reality of what's going on. And that's what he's trying to teach us.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying he kind of, like he does say himself, that his teaching will be kind of too materialistic for the general spiritualists and too like spiritual for the general materialists. So like he does kind of say that he's presenting a view that doesn't kind of sit with normal sort of Western rationalism, or like the kind of stereotypical Eastern sort of idealism, that his teaching is something like, a blend of the two or a mix in the two. He kind of talks about a more sort of practical spirituality and this need for actual work in the, the physical world then. And that real evolution is then possible, that development is not just illusory, that there has been real changes in the past and that real changes are possible. But again, by the fact that if real change is possible, then there can be good and bad change. That is a real potential. So he does seem to emphasize this then, if there can be the real potential for loss of knowledge and wisdom, that there is this, this real work needed for people to preserve and, knowledge. And again, his idea with like the Samoon Brotherhood and stuff, I think, doesn't it like translate, there's a connotation there of like to do with bees and honey, and the bees storing the honey, and this like honey bee, you could say, this stuff of like wisdom or knowledge,
which is why it's a symbol for the Samoon Brotherhood, is the bee.
Yeah. So with like, with his Atlantis story, that's like, he's always talking about it like in a woeful sense of this like remorse of this loss that happened, of this, of these fruits, these insights or this wisdom attainments that had been, developed at a certain period of time, but that actually, did get lost through a kind of a mixture of circumstances. Like, he talks about sort of natural processes and conditions being involved in that loss, as well as like individual actions of people, so he doesn't just like blame, you could say, individual people and their actions, but he also blames, and if you like, natural processes. So he just says that those kind of things are both contributing to this potential loss or real loss of like, wisdom.
Well, when he lands, Atlantis is the chief continent on planet Earth. It's got the most people, and they're all ruled by King I've forgotten his name. King Apollos.
Apollos, yeah.
Apollos, that's it. And at that time, they'd had the Kundabuffer removed, but it hadn't crystallized in them, I think. Is that?
Yeah.
He says that later, it was towards the end of the Atlantean period, that the Kundabuffer started to crystallize in the Atlanteans. So before this catastrophe that we'll talk about in a short while. So the people were doing their duty, weren't they? They were using all three centers and working on themselves and doing what down here, they understood their role. They knew what their duty or their being duty was.
Yeah, like he talks about them having a knowledge, you know, a higher knowledge of kind of man's purpose in like the cosmos, you know, the role he was supposed to perform. And of course in like Beelzebub and other, you know, Gurdjieff's ideas, that role that man has is kind of related to the transformation of energies or substances that man is required to transform or produce, you know, liberate certain energies or certain substances that have a role to play in the cosmos. So he talks about like them having a knowledge of like, doesn't he talk about help to the moon?
That's it,
So
yes.
he says they referred to, I think, to the second being food. So this is like air or breath. They kind of refer to that as help to the moon, and that they had this idea that they needed to transform their second being food, their breath, the material in their breath and the energy in it, and the possibilities that breath gives us. They needed to work on that to, you know, say feed the moon, then, in terms of the moon being this new kind of player in the creation, the latest sort of body, you know, to arise or be developed. Or, you know, Gurdjieff gives the analogy of the growing end of a shoot, like a plant. It's the, you know, it's at the foremost end of development or transformation or growth, you know. So because it's in that place, it requires a certain kind of you know, food for its growth. So they had this kind of knowledge that partially we had to serve the moon or transform these energies that were required, you know, to support and maintain the natural processes in the universe, in the solar system, the ongoing growth and development.
Yeah, I've got that.
So,
I'm just going to read that bit here, actually. The free-brain beings of the continent Atlantis of that period, namely the period then called the Samleosian, and Samlos was the name of the city in Atlantis. So in the then called the Samleosian civilization, even devised and very strictly practiced certain customs that greatly contributed to the fulfillment of those being duties as productively as possible. The beings of the continent Atlantis even very wisely and expediently devised the fulfillment of these two being duties, namely the duty of the perfecting of their higher bodies and the duty of serving the most great cosmic trogo-auto-egocrat by uniting them into one and performing them simultaneously. And that again is like what you're saying, that's helping with the work of sending the energy to the moon, isn't it?
Yeah. So like he does say that they had this, you know, they had this knowledge of a greater knowledge of our, you know, say our purpose, and they had the greater sort of knowledge of how to, you know, how to fulfill that purpose. They had a greater knowledge of how to transform these different foods that we receive, the physical food, the air, and impressions. They had a greater knowledge of how to internally kind of like transform that into, you know, the suitable materials, you know, that were required. And so he kind of says that they also, by kind of virtue of having that sort of inner alchemy knowledge, let's say, they also had an idea of how, maybe a better idea of how to structure society in a way that could kind of deal with man's psyche. Like if you have a greater kind of knowledge of psychology, let's say, then you might have a better idea of how to structure society in order to deal with the nature of the average man, you know. Like if you kind of know what are the general triggers and what stresses and things, and how these can, what results they can cause in the average person, then you might have a better idea of how you need to structure society in order to avoid these kind of stresses that can, you know, manifest negatively in the average man, because he might not be able to, you know, control himself, you know. So they maybe have a better idea of how to suit the society to the given, you know, level of development of man, to make things a bit more peaceful, you know. So I mean, one way of looking at that is that they had a better idea of how to control, you know, the average man, keep him within, you know,
It's not under like keeping him within like under control of like people what are saying today are happening in this pandemic. It's all a way to control us. It was in a more harmonious way, so that the whole, everybody can live together.
Yeah, I don't mean like necessarily you know, authoritarian, but just that they had more of a sense of how to keep, again, I'm just using the word keep, in a more, you could say, than a harmonious state, a way to prevent the kind of big blow-ups that can happen, you know, in man because of his general, you know, level of being. I mean, Gurdjieff does say that a lot of the time, that if man, you know, had a different level of being, then yeah, situations wouldn't need to be like the way they are now. Like he often refers to the higher beings having to interact with us in a certain way because we don't have this ableness, the required ableness to be able to do our duty. So we need some help, but that external help to an extent has to come in the form of, you could say, control or acting upon us, because we're not able to do it. Just in the same way that as a parent, to an extent, sometimes you have to kind of control the child. You maybe have to take away his liberties. You maybe have to ground the child, or you know what I mean. So you do have that kind of a role of control over the child into saying what like he can and can't do. You do have a sort of role that way. But obviously the idea is that it's only for a limited time till the child grows up and becomes able to control himself, make the right decisions. But maybe we're in that position that we do have to be controlled to an extent. But of course, that could be in different ways. Like you're saying, it was more just the idea of control being to promote a harmonious society. So I'm saying they maybe had a better way of how to kind of work on the sly, you could say. Like they knew how to make conditions that could keep man from, negative behaviors, even a subconscious way, even ways that weren't obvious to him. Do you see what I mean? Just because of the natural, like he might not have had any idea why certain customs were created in society. He might not know that, but he might just engage with them because that's what the customs are and that's what he's been told to do. But those customs might have some beneficial effect on him and on his psyche and stuff. They might, so saying they might have had a roundabout way to help, the average man, help him, perform his duty and not be so possibly damaging to himself and others.
Well, they seem to have quite a lot of knowledge that we don't have now, especially cosmological, and I think that brings society together if you're sharing everything. Because Gurdjieff talks about the other moon, that our planet has two moons, and the other one is, we can't see it with our naked eye, called Anulius.
Yeah.
And the Atlanteans knew about this other moon. So they're sharing the cosmology amongst each other. So they're not keeping anything withdrawn or secret. They're trying to all learn and grow together.
Yeah. Well, they might have had a much better kind of system of society in terms of like things being shared and things like that. And yes, their greater cosmological knowledge, like we're saying, might have enabled them to have a greater knowledge of like psychology. Again, the idea that like cosmological knowledge reflects psychological knowledge. So if you kind of learn more about one, you can learn more about the other. But yeah, so like there's the kind of I think there's the idea there, another way that he uses Atlantis kind of as a metaphor for like the subconscious. Like he talks about our real consciousness being our subconsciousness, and that kind of real consciousness, of course, being pushed into the background or kind of becoming submerged, and us coming to live in what he calls like the fictitious consciousness, So I think a lot of the time he kind of is using it as well as a kind of a metaphor for that relationship in ourselves between the kind of consciousness and subconsciousness, and that a lot of the
fictitious consciousness, that's because of the Kundabuffer, isn't it? Even though they took it away, we still have it. We loved it so much, that way of living, apparently, humans, that it's carried on that way, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, like you're saying, he does talk of that time of Atlantis being, like you're saying, when from then on, when the kind of consequences of the Kundabuffer became more, detrimental, became more crystallized, he kind of refers to, like, again, like pre-Atlantis or Atlantis and post-Atlantis as a a significant point of change, and generally sort of negative change. So I think he does use this point of change to express this relationship, between our like consciousness and subconsciousness, and like certain capacities in ourselves becoming submerged, like Atlantis going under the waters, and us beginning to maybe live in a more sort of superficial part of our nature. And again, like he had a lot of ideas about Atlantis, and again, some of them he kind of connected it with the development of our sort of again, our kind of what you might call our rational sort of consciousness. Like he kind of says that this, what we might think is sort of like higher capacities, that we might think of like telepathy and things like that. You could say that they're of the subconsciousness, and he kind of says, Steiner, that we had these capacities in the past. That was natural to us, we were using them, but then they had to, you could say, disappear or go into the background in order for to other capacities, which we link with rationalism and science and what he kind of calls like the ego, our sense of self, our ego consciousness. So, a few of them different traditions talk about a similar kind of process, where like certain capacities had to be lost, but lost for some kind of purpose, in order to develop something else. So okay, then we say we lost these subconscious capacities and had to develop the sort of rational capacities in this ego consciousness. But then I think again, like both Gurdjieff and Steiner kind of suggest that now where we are, we're in this position where, okay, we have developed the sort of rational consciousness, so we need to reintegrate or rediscover this subconsciousness and start to begin the process of bringing them together, being able to live in these two kind of worlds, or have access to these two kind of forms of consciousness in a harmonious way.
Well, it's interesting you bring Steiner up, because obviously he was a contemporary with Gurdjieff, and he, as well as Gurdjieff, they both said that the next 100 years would be very vital to humanity and how things could change for the good or for the bad, which kind of always makes me think, well, things aren't fated then, are they? If it could go either way, that means anything could happen. And Steiner said that it would be 100 years. He gave a lecture in 1916, and he said in the next 100 years would be very vital, which is 2016, which was the year that we lost many, many people, with David Bowie starting the trend of death.
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
And it's kind of like does feel like there's some kind of awakening going on, but and there are people hearing it, and thankfully we have the internet for people to stay in touch that are not sure what to do with themselves, or are coming to this kind of work, or trying to find people like Steiner or Blavatsky's work or Gurdjieff's writings to fulfill that hole, or to not fulfill, but to fill that hole, that they realize things aren't what we're told they are in the rational world.
Yeah, well, like you say, we might be at this point in time where we are at this point of change, or kind of, you could say, like a point of transition between, you could say, two different worlds, and or we're at a point where there's an attempt to kind of synthesize two different, apparently kind of contradictory aspects. Like at this moment, we do have this apparently kind of intense contradiction between like science and religion. We're at maybe an unprecedented moment where there is such a kind of apparent divorce between the two, or where the two maybe in the average person's mind, where the two are like maybe complete opposites, whereas in most of the past, so far as we know, religion and science have always been, kind of the same thing, part of the same thing. Yeah. So yeah, it does seem that we are in, a heightened period of like duality, of tension, and that obviously brings negative possibilities with it, but it also maybe brings, like in terms of the work, like positive. There's a lot of potential there when you've got these two contradictory things. There's a lot of energy there, but like we're saying, there's no guarantee how that energy is going to manifest. It could manifest in a bomb, so to speak, or it could manifest in some like really creative process, like evolution, something miraculous, transformation. But yeah,
No, you go.
I was just going to say that there's always seems to be this connection, this thread, and like in Beelzebub and like Steiner and stuff, how natural cycles and processes are intertwined with, well, man, and also like his psychology and his development of civilizations. There's always seems to be this intertwining of natural processes and changes in, man's history, significant changes in like the course of his development internally and in civilization. Like, there's always these miracles that seem to involve natural processes, like Moses and things like that. So there does seem to be this idea in all the religions then that one means of change, and potentially positive change, will come through these natural processes, which can appear to us as catastrophes,
And it often is a catastrophe that changes things. And in Beelzebub's tales, the sinking of Atlantis is because of I hope I say this right, Transparnian perturbation, which is a comet hitting the planet and making Atlantis sink inwards down into the seas.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a bit about this Transparnian perturbation. I hate saying it. I'm sure I'm getting it wrong.
Yeah, I think it's trans-Nepalian, I don't know, but yeah, who's to say? But yeah, so again, there's this idea that natural cycles, natural events, are involved in producing changes. There are a means of change in the world and in man's world, and that often those changes those changes can seem negative to us, like they could involve death and suffering. They may be, a needed means, to change, so it's often hard for us to see how you know, something like, say, the coronavirus, I think how that can be possibly a positive means for change, or how there is an actual opportunity provided, you know, through those conditions for some positive change. You know, I think we find it hard to see how we can make use of those, you know, those conditions. But again, I just think with this like submergence, you know, of the content within that, you know, he's talking about, at least at one level, the kind of the two consciousnesses, like the submergence of the real consciousness kind of, you know, into the background, and the emergence then of what we call a normal consciousness and our sense of self into the foreground. So again, that, like, and some people have looked at that in terms of the two halves of the brain, you know, you know, and then, you know, because they are kind of very separatized, aren't they? The two halves of the brain, they're like almost, you know, completely separate, except for a small means of interchange. I think the corpus callosum, isn't it? You know, the little kind of formation that sits between the two, and kind of is the means of exchange and communication between the two hemispheres. So there are ideas that each sort of hemisphere is almost like a mind. So we have like two minds, you know, but how they operate is usually kind of in mutual exclusion. You know, we find it hard to operate with the two together, or have some kind of state that bridges both. You know, I think usually if we're conscious, the subconscious is completely out of our awareness, oblivious to it. And if we're subconscious, usually the means that we can get into that, we have to kind of lose consciousness. You see what I mean? Normally we have to kind of like, we only access subconsciousness through trance states, usually intense ones, where we kind of cease to have normal functionality, you know. So there does seem to be this like divorce between these two consciousnesses, or these two kind of sides of our nature. So yeah, this like, you know, sinking of Atlantis into the earth can be representing this loss of those kind of more subconscious facilities in us, you know, or just real consciousness, that we've come to live in a more sort of superficial part of our nature. And again, he talks about in Beelzebub, I think this boule marchano, a term for this kind of like tablet that got split into two. This tablet had carved into it this teaching about sort of you could say like the law of three, you know, how the three forces operate, and you know, it got written down, but it got split up, and those two parts got separated on like different halves of the earth, and even went into the earth, like got lost underground and things. And Beelzebub was interested in kind of retrieving this teaching, you know, that had been put onto this tablet. And I think he had to use, or resorted to using like mediums, what we would call mediums, with you know, a bit more of access to their subconscious, you know. So he kind of refers to using people with a bit more subconscious connection in order to gain knowledge about this lost knowledge, or you could say gain knowledge about this separation between the consciousness and the subconscious, and how this happened, and, you know, what could be involved in reuniting them, you know, discovering how to bring the subconsciousness and the consciousness back together, you know, like reuniting these two halves of the tablet, the teaching, which when they put together, then you can kind of get the full teaching.
It's quite magical, isn't it? Because also, I don't know if he knew the man or had heard of the man, but again, contemporary with Gurdjieff was Dr. Duran, and he was the man who apparently found the emerald tablets of Thoth.
Oh yeah.
1920s, and he found them on an emerald tablet, strange writing, not hieroglyphs, but like hieroglyphs on them that no one could decipher, and he had to put himself into a certain trance to decipher them.
Yeah.
And that's why we have the emerald tablets of Thoth now written in English. And then he put them back, I think he put them back in the pyramid, and they've disappeared. And I often wondered, I wonder if Gurdjieff ever heard of him or knew of that story.
Yeah.
Because it does seem to be something a lot about these hieroglyphs when you look at them, or this picture writing. I feel like if I concentrated on it enough, I'd be able to understand what it's saying.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you that, again, you could look at that in terms of his idea of legomenism. So in Beelzebub Tales, he uses this word legomenism as a kind of a means that people used to use in order to transmit information or communicate wisdom, you know, means of teaching, you could say. So like, maybe like you're saying, this guy, in order to, you know, understand the tablet, he had to kind of utilize sort of like mental form, you know, this other form of mentation that you could link with the subconsciousness, the state that's present in all of us, but we struggle to, you know, access it in a kind of intentional or coherent way. We can have, like, you know, experiences or connections that can kind of come of themselves and seem random, but we don't seem to have much of a like coherent or ordered, intentional ability to connect with it at will, say, do you know what I mean? Access those capacities. But yeah, so it seems to be happen a lot, you know, again, repeatedly, this apparent loss of wisdom or knowledge, and then it's re-emergence again, and people having to put it together, like him having to be able to work out the meaning of the tablet and decipher it and stuff. So there seems to be this ongoing like forgetting and then remembering, or like this a loss of knowledge, and then people find a scrap of it and then they manage to reconstruct it again, and then it gets lost, but there's still a little bit that remains, enough for someone to find it and build it up again, you know. So it's this kind of, it's a strange kind of movement if you try to, you know, picture it. And it just seems weird, you know. You could think that if things are just developed and lost again, you could just look at it as that zero sum game. You could think, well, how can things actually develop, you know, if reality is that way, that there isn't a stable foundation, things can be developed but then lost. Again, the Tower of Babel or Babel, that seems like another kind of like, you know, archetypal image for this idea that we can build these towers, or like of knowledge and wisdom can, you know, can be developed in times, in civilizations, but they never seem to last. They never seem to be built on like
well, on
a
that
solid...
one, the gods got annoyed, didn't they, and came and knocked it down and made everyone speak in a different language.
Yeah, well, again, this idea of the language, and they said like go down and confound their language. You know, they didn't like that this tower was getting like too high and stuff. You could say, oh, that maybe that their knowledge was advancing too much. So again, there could be a link here with the Kunda buffer, like Gurdjieff kind of talked in that way. That I think he said something about man's development being a bit too out of kilter with the needs of the solar system. So his development had to be slowed down for a time.
And that's why we were given the Kunda buffer. Yes.
Yeah. So again, this Kunda buffer could be this interference between the subconsciousness and the consciousness, or what created this kind of, what created the two of them, you could say, and that what interfered then with our ability, for example, communicate with each other, be able to speak the same language, you know. So that had a negative effect, like obviously all the consequences of the Kunda buffer. But also there are these ideas that it was maybe perhaps needed, and that it also has enabled something else to be developed. You know, like you can think in terms of like the idea of specialization and how cells and, you know, develop, and at least the idea of how like natural evolution happens, that cells have to kind of divide and focus on a specific, you know, activity and just engage in that and develop that, rather than just like being a multitasker, you know. So like this specialization can be a means to really develop in some particular area, although specialization brings problems, like with communication. You know, people can just learn one kind of knowledge and become really adept at that, but not have like a general common sense, you know. So we lost something in terms of, you could say, common sense, or like this more general ability to understand each other and speak the same language. But through the kind of creation of the new languages, or the loss of that ability, apparently, we were able to make certain other advancements that kind of maybe wouldn't have been able to happen if we didn't. So like kind of lose the ability to kind of automatically just be able to understand each other, you know, without maybe an effort.
Well, one of my favourite sayings is that common sense isn't very common in this day and age.
Yeah. And a lot of people, again, have talked about that split, like between the conscious and the subconscious, or the two halves of the brain, with the idea about there's like, I can't remember the name of the author, but the guy wrote a book about the bicameral mind. So this idea again of how the consciousness and subconsciousness, or the two halves of the brain, kind of, you could say, separated or kind of attained their relationship that they have now. And the idea was that our kind of relationship to thought changed, and there's a connection between thought and thoth. You know, there might be a connection there. Yeah. So maybe prior to that, this Kunda buffer and submergence of Atlantis, and, you know, this catastrophe change, maybe we didn't have the same relationship to our thoughts. Like, you know, people talk about the idea of like speaking with the gods and things. So maybe people experience their thoughts in that way. There wasn't the same kind of sense of ownership. Nowadays, we take it for granted that these voices in my head, then let's say that if you're talking about thinking verbally, you know, we take it for granted that it's me, or we automatically have a sense that it's, you know, this is me who's initiating this capacity, and, you know, it's not some other coming from somewhere else. You know, we kind of think, for some reason, regard our thoughts as our own and as emerging within us, you know, rather than, we don't kind of have the sense usually of our thoughts coming from I don't know,
from
some
without.
external source. I mean, maybe we get glimpses of that when we have what we call like something out of the blue, where maybe some insight suddenly pops into our head. In those moments, it's kind of obvious to us that thoughts kind of emerge from somewhere other than our own intention, you know. Because like in those moments, it's almost like despite ourselves, you have this insight, or it could be something that you weren't trying to, you know, think about or work out. Maybe you had been thinking about a problem and then you stopped thinking about it, and then the idea, you know, the solution was shown to you without you in your conscious mind making any effort at that moment to work it out. So yeah, maybe there was this change in this relationship to thinking, you know. Like nowadays we do take it for granted that it's kind of us, you know, who thinks, who initiates thoughts, and you know, where they come from. Yeah, that they come from us, and that it's us, the voice in our head, then, or the pictures that, you know,
No,
they're coming from.
many times I've realised my thoughts are coming from without.
Yeah, yeah, and we kind of we regard them now as just like, generally again, we either think in terms of like words or pictures, and we kind of just regard them as, you could say, like almost inanimate stuff. I don't kind of like, you know, regard my thoughts then as almost like, you could say, an entity, you know, something that is kind of living or, you know, has some independence to, you know, me. We just kind of see them as data. Do you see what I mean? You could, you know, we don't have that sort of relationship to our thinking and our thoughts as like something living, you know, as something external to us. And again, this like losing of the subconscious can reflect in our attitudes towards like spirit world and these other beings. You know, it's like saying that sort of change stopped us from being able to, you could say, see like spirits and being able to engage with what we call the spirit realm. And you could, you know, so you could think, well, how did that happen, or what does that mean? I think it kind of means that we cease to be, that they're still here and that we're kind of really aware of them, but we cease to be able to see them as living now. Instead of seeing them as kind of alive, we just see it as data, you know. So I could be like having a thought could come into my head like an inspiration, and I might just experience that as a thought, whereas maybe back in the day I would have experienced that as an encounter with, like, say, an angel, you know, like an insight could have been an encounter with a messenger, the thing that brings, you know. So it's like we turn these living things into like processes. You see what I mean? Instead of like us being able to have a living encounter, let's say, with the spirit of a tree, and that being obvious to us that there is a living kind of entity that is the tree, or you could in the tree. Nowadays we just see it as a form, although we can rationally appreciate that a tree is a form of life. We don't really have much sense of that as a direct experience, you know. I mean, we have it with people because they seem to be more sort of moving and responding in a way that we can recognize, but we seem to have lost that sort of connection with nature, you know, or with things that appear to us to be slightly more inanimate. Of course, we can have a sense of relationship with animals because they're a bit more moving than a tree, you know, but we still have a certain sense of a barrier there of communication, that though we can have a certain empathy with animals, we can recognize like emotional states in them that are the same in us, and we can recognize characters of, you know, animals. They have their own character. But in terms of direct communication, we can still experience limitations there. Like an animal might be making noises and we don't, like, what do you want? You know, it might not be clear to us.
We can
So
sense it.
yeah, we can have a level of communication, but it's just that has kind of become again more subconscious to us, you know. So we don't seem to have it as a kind of a conscious communication in the same way that we appear to be able to, you know, like I appear to be able to talk to you in a kind of conscious way directly, in a way that I don't appear to be able to with a tree, let's say, you know, even though I might be able to have some more feely sort of communication with it, but it still might remain unarticulate to me. I might have a sense of some communication with nature, but I might, you know, that it is as if it's speaking to me, but I might not really be able to get what it's saying, you know. So people can have a sense of like communion with nature and that they are engaging with a living presence, but just that the level of communication might be still at a, you know, an unarticulate level that we, you know. So that again, that might be because we've lost these kind of subconscious capacities, or we've lost this ability to kind of see the spirit world as living, as something alive. We've kind of reduced it to, you know, processes, you know. So it's like, it's a strange thing that what determines whether we see something as alive, like a being, or just as a thing and a process, you know.
And I'm kind of hoping that in this lockdown, because we're still in it, sadly, hope we're coming to the end, hopefully. But in this
Hope so.
lockdown, I'm really hoping people have been noticing this, because I have noticed there's people out in the woods and the fields and the heath more. So hopefully people are reconnecting to nature.
Yeah.
Hopefully there's people out there perhaps finding their mediumistic skills are suddenly coming out, where they're having to spend all this time at home on their own, might be wondering where them voices are, and suddenly realizing they have the ability to speak to spirit, or I don't know, angels, or the plants, who knows.
Yeah.
Hopefully these things are being developed, and after lockdown ends, we might find all these new people with new super tools that make them rethink how they live.
Yeah, we can but hope. I mean, it does seem to me that those capacities, like what we talk about then, as imagined to be, angels and spirits, I think we do have the capacity to engage with that realm, and that we are engaging with it all the time. It's just how we've come to see it, how we've come to interpret it, has changed. That the way we interpret it now kind of removes the sort of vital, the vital essence of it. We've lost that side of it, and that loss has negative effects in us. That's kind of what can lead to a lot of our feelings of isolation and suffering and depression and things that can come, because people can feel isolated. They can feel that they just exist in a kind of like cold, material, dead world, that they're not engaging with something or part of something that kind of is living and kind of meaningful. Because obviously if you had a more sort of like maybe the ancients did, that had the sense that you were interacting with a living, that everything was living, then there's a greater sense of communion there. You never kind of maybe the ancients were never lonely or didn't experience that same kind of sense that people maybe do these days, because they were always in connection with the the spirits and of whatever their environment was.
But they would also have had great teachers in Atlantis, and something which I think we need now in these days. But they had the Society of Akodan.
Yeah.
Hopefully I've said that right. Who were a very learned set of men, and hopefully women. I don't think it specifies in Beelzebub's tales if it's both sexes, but I'm sure it was. Maybe you could tell us a bit about what you know about the Society of Akodan, because well, they're known. It says in the book they're called the Learned Society, and they were formed 735 years before the Transparlian perturbation, and they were based in Atlantis. But we do know that they went off to other areas, which is why some of them survived after the Great Catastrophe, and why some Atlanteans brought knowledge to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it's been a while since I've read all the tales, so I won't be able to regale you with all the different episodes. But he seems to talk about them as like almost the forefathers of what we would regard as like culture. He almost talks about that as kind of the origin of what we might recognize now as culture, and like the beginning of like the development of the sciences. So that the beginning of this sort of organized effort to, you could say, acquire wisdom and develop wisdom and preserve it. So like I would say the beginnings of what we would think about a man starting culture, and his ideas about his question as to why, and how, so what we might think today is like, back at the sort of time of the Ice Age and things, where we find our first evidence of what we know as culture, like art, and sculptures, or toys, or things that we don't see as just, to do with survival. They're not just tools that people have, things that are unnecessary, So I think he kind of talks about them as, it's like really the forefathers of, the first almost like beings, you could say, then that had this development that enabled them to think in that way, and to be concerned with other things than just like survival, being able to respond to a larger, deeper purpose. So, and he also talks about them in terms of like he mentions their emblem. Was it their emblem, like this, like the thing that was like the Sphinx, that they had?
Yes. Statue of conscience.
Yeah, so like you said again, that they had this, they were like some of the origin, or the first people to have this knowledge. The first people.
Just looking to see if I've got any near me. I'll make some.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any statues nearby, but I'll stick one up as a picture. So they have the body of a lion, torso of an eagle, legs of the lion, body of a bull,
yeah,
wings of a eagle,
yeah, and then it had
made of amber, and a pair of breasts for a head.
Yeah. So like you're saying, that sort of allegorical, symbolic figure representing the different kind of qualities that are needed for development, and also kind of the relationship, you could say, the different centers, So he kind of, again, speaks of them as maybe the first people who developed this sort of knowledge of like conscience, you know. And again, conscience was his big thing as the only impulse that could kind of save man, you know, or the only impulse that was left to him, available to him to use to develop and come to be able to perform, you know, his function. So, you know, a lot of people, I mean, even in the Bible and stuff, there's like ideas that the higher powers kind of came down and interacted with early man, you know, in a particular way to, you could say, give evolution. And they often refer to some of these first sort of beings who were created from that first, you know, interaction of the higher powers with man. And some people talk about it like in terms of mating, you know, like angels came down and mated with women, you know. So they kind of talk about the first generation of those beings as like, you know, like giants and like, you know, having different kind of capacities, like what we might think as like, you know, higher intelligence, and also maybe what we might think as supernatural capacities. So different teachers do have these ideas that there was an influence of like a higher realm into early man, and that's what kind of has enabled his development. And a lot of them speak of that at the level of beings, you know. They talk about an actual higher kind of beings mating with man and producing a kind of, you know, a hybrid that then was kind of our, you know, our ancestor that you know, modern man has come from. So again, there could be a link here with like, you know, the arising of the Alcaldan society as being like some of this early generation of this, you know, first sort of evolution of man's consciousness. And that maybe because the role they had to serve, they had to be given a higher kind of level of capacity, like maybe like supermen, than what we are able to attain now. Maybe they had to be given certain extra capacities because they needed to serve that role, you know, to like help teach man, you know, and develop and maybe show him that certain things were possible, you know. So, and Beelzebub does talk that way, doesn't he, about some of his tribe, you know, being sent, that outcast, you know, sent to Earth, and that obviously they had like a different form, you know, like he talks about his tails and horns and stuff. And he kind of says that that's how our ideas about sort of, you know, our normal sort of typical ideas about angels and devils of stuff came about because the early man interacted with this, you know, with like this other form of being, or like Beelzebub's tribe, these beings who'd been exiled. So you could see this exile as like, you know, some of these sort of first generation of beings who were like neither one nor the other. They weren't like the men who were around them, who the natural man that they'd been born into, and they weren't like the higher beings who they maybe had something of, you know, like the DNA of the higher angels, you know. So they were neither one thing, you know, kind of nor the other.
Because they had their little hooves, didn't they, for feet? Beelzebub's got hooves, and his people, yeah. Like I always thought it was like pig hooves.
Yeah.
Curly tail like a pig. And Beelzebub had his horns shaved off, though, hadn't he?
Yeah, well, I think. I think they say that at a certain point in time, that him and his tribe got told that they had to, like, you could say, hide themselves or hide their external form from humans. But where saying prior, up to a certain point, they were just, you know, allowed to freely interact with the beings. But at a certain point in time, they had to hide because of these certain ideas that were, you know, that were being generated in men, or they were having a kind of because of their obvious, like, different appearance, they started to have a negative effect. So again, you could look back in history at these maybe super men who had to be, you know, created by like angels interacting with humans to enable like the development of, you know, humanity. Maybe at a certain point in time, of course, they had to, you know, kind of be removed from the equation because they'd served their purpose. And if they still hanged around, you could say that the normal man wouldn't be able to have a kind of a natural line of development. You know, it'd be quite, if we were interacting with beings on the earth who were like had horns and who were so far advanced than us, it would it might inhibit us from learning ourselves. Do you see what I mean?
Well, I know what us humans would like. We'd get really annoyed with them because they were better than us.
Exactly.
And would probably, you know, like we crucified Jesus, we killed all the good people, you know, we would have turned against them.
So again, you could just see this as an idea that like certain capacities had to be exaggerated maybe in early man, like really amped up to enable a more sort of normal line of evolution, that those supermen had to then become teachers and foster sort of a more regular, you know, ascent of evolution for man. But then at a certain point in time, they had to disappear, you know. So this could be another sort of analogy for the capacities in ourselves. We had to have these, you know, heightened capacities got given to us, you know, to man, because that's what we need. They were, you know, they were related to the high purpose that we were supposed to serve. But then again, they had to kind of disappear into the background to allow other, other capacities to develop. So again, the idea of the continent disappearing and the idea of these beings like being present on the earth and then having to like hide can be, versions of the same story, just referring to these higher capacities that now seem to have to remain hidden.
Well, I have, hold on, just dropped everything. I was going to bring up about the Atlanteans like trinkets. They liked talismans and objects marked with magical signs. And Atlanteans used pearls. Now, do you think there's anything important about the use of pearls in their talismans or their trinkets? Is there something? Because a pearl's inside inside an oyster, so they've got.
Yeah.
I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, again, you might be using that as I mean, he again seems to emphasize these two sides, that with the development of intelligence that was given to man, that kind of gave rise to culture, along with those benefits that came with culture, there was also the downside. So yeah, not only did man be able to come to like, develop sciences, but he also became interested in, what we might see as negative things like fashion and stuff like that. So he often seems to contrast, what we might see as development as having both these sides. It can have good effects and negative effects. So that might be one thing. It might just be saying, along with culture and the good things with that, there also became like fashion and these, kind of interesting and unnecessary things, or interesting just like pleasures, like fascination and titillation, like shiny objects stuff. So that could be another hint to the beginnings of this like descent and the deeper crystallization of the consequences for becoming more interested in superficial things like the surface colors and ceasing to have a true sense of worth, becoming more interested in jewels than knowledge. But so that's one, the negative kind of connotation. But the other positive one might be that they just had a greater sort of connection with the mentation by form and the subconscious, and that they utilize like pearls and natural substances that have kind of, strange visual properties to evoke like subconscious states in themselves. Like, of course, we have the idea of hypnotism, that you can do it from shiny objects, and Gurdjieff talks about that ancient beings had a greater capacity to access that state, the hypnotic state in themselves. And one way could be through like fascination, through the use of an object, and that can be also like a talisman. So, an object, we don't necessarily have to stare at it, that can be one way, but also just investing, value and emotion.
Putting your intention into
something. So I would say he might be referring to that just again another way of showing that they had a greater access to, say, the subconscious capacities, but even so, that they were still, even at that point, they were still starting to have to use external means to connect with that. So again, like the beginning seeds of this separation, that we're becoming further and further separated from these capacities, that we were having to use more and more, kind of externalized means to connect with something that, was already in us,
Well, I didn't have anything else really on Atlantis, apart from I was going to bring up about the bullshit Anu myself, because that's towards the end of the book, because that was done by Macarai, I've forgotten his name now. Kronberg, yeah.
Kronbergsion or something like that.
That's it, Kronbergsion. It's definitely Zion at the end.
Yeah.
But he put all the history, I think it was him, the history of the Akudans. He had it recorded onto the Cork Capitanian fault tapes, which I thought was a bit like maybe the Akashic records.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could perhaps talk about that a little bit.
Well, so again, like, doesn't he, like we were saying before, that in order to like find the Bulmar-Shanu, he had to kind of resort to Pythonesses, I think he called them, something like that. Pythonesses, these, and they tended to be women.
The Python, yes, it was the Pythoness, the party Pythoness. He had to go. She forewarned the party Pythoness forewarned all the Atlanteans that the comet was coming.
Yeah.
Most people ignored her, but that's when they were deep. The Kundabuffer was influencing them. So many run off, but the Akudans took what she had to say, and I think that's why many of the Akudan society managed to get to other continents like India, Africa, and things like that.
Yeah. So like in talking about this, in being able to find this tablet, which this Bill Marciano, which you could say again has this knowledge, this wisdom in it. In order to find that, he had to resort to the use of these Pythonesses who had this, you know, this, you could say, this subconscious capacity to, you know, to tap into the subconscious faculties, what we might see as like telepathy and other things like that, or mediumship capacities. So, you know, he definitely seems to be highlighting that this tablet, you know, has this connection to these subconscious capacities that he's having to use to find the tablet. You know, the kind of the knowledge contained in the tablet, you could say, has this knowledge of the history of the nature of the subconsciousness and the consciousness and how that relationship has changed. You know, so it's like we have to, you know, use what sort of little remnants remain of this like connection in us, these subconscious faculties, in order to, like, you know, dig up the treasure, bring these two halves back together. You know, so like, yeah, those Pythonesses, they tend to be women, and it was the women that tend to have that role. So again, you know, the female has tended to be associated with the more sort of hidden side of our nature, and with these what we might consider to be the kind of artistic skills or crafts, you know, like dance. You know, in the past he talks about like temple dances being performed, you know, by the women and things. So he does seem to suggest that kind of the female nature, you know, he kind of relates to the subconscious nature, you could say that, and that maybe that in females there is a bit more of that connection left, maybe. Do you know what I mean? And we could maybe connect that with, like, you know, them have been, you know, well, being the sex who gives birth, you know, that maybe because they still have those physical, they still go through those physical processes, that maybe they retain a bit more of a connection with those, you know, subconscious capacities, which is why that in the past it was, you know, it was women who served that function. So again, using the woman, he might just be referring again to the female as like Sophia and wisdom, and this kind of hidden wisdom that's, you know, become lost, a more subtle wisdom that's different to, you know, rational kind of wisdom. And also Pythonesses, again, he's looking at with the snake. And so you've got like the, you know, Kundalini and the kind of natural energies of the body and the earth, which again are often depicted as Mother Earth. You know, they're given sort of female, you know, qualities.
It was quite weird when I was rereading all this for our talk. I'd always thought of it before as quite Egyptian, all this storytelling about Atlantis and that. But as I was reading, I don't know if it's because I went to Greece last year, I suddenly thought, no, it's quite Greek actually, with the Pythoness. The Greeks have a Sphinx. Okay, it's different from the Egyptian Sphinx.
Yeah.
Because that's what got me thinking about, we don't know if the statue of conscience is lying down like the Egyptian Sphinx of Giza, or if it's sitting like the Greek Sphinxes, sits up with a female head and female breasts, but the rest of the body's the same, eagle wings, lion.
So again, he seems to talk about this Atlantis and this Alcaldan society as like the origin of all these other different, you know, religions. So again, it seems to me like to visualize it as like a nexus point, you know, from which all these different shoots and offshoots, you know, spring. So again, in us, you can think about it in how, you know, how our mind and how our experience works. You can think of the kind of, you know, the Alcaldan center as what is the center for all the sort of diversity that gets birthed in us, like all the different thoughts that could come in, you know, come into my mind. It's kind of the place that I begin from. You know, any line of thought begins from somewhere, and I seem to at the end wind up back where I started from. It's, you know what I mean? I start from here down some train of thought, and at the end of it, it seems to be finished, and I come back and I start another one. So it does seem to be this place of, like, you could say, beginning, and the place of, you know, like the apex of the triangle, isn't it? Where sort of diversity, you know, the source of diversity, variance, where that comes from. And also then that's kind of the means of like what can unify all the apparently diverse differences and variations, you know, the principle of unity. So again, this thing that can reconstruct, like the tablets, you know, coming back together, and like Humpty Dumpty, you know, the story of how can you put this thing back together again once it's been cracked, you know, or like Fragments of the Unknown Teaching. That was the first title, wasn't it, for In Search of the Miraculous by Ouspensky.
And he had to change it because his friend G.R. Mead had just brought out a book almost with exactly the same title. I think it was Fragments of something else, so that's why he had to change it.
But I mean, I like this idea again of like that there's only these like remnants, these fragments, these partial elements that might seem unconnected. That's what you've got. That's all we've got access to. We have to make something out of it or put them back together. So none of the teachings or wisdom exists in a whole form. It's like saying now everything is kind of scattered and separated and kind of a bit mixed. So you're going to be in the situation of having to kind of make a synthesis. Pull these different elements together. Rather
quite
than
an
like,
adventure as well. I
Yeah.
know at times I get frustrated with it all, but I know once I'm back onto a new track, I'm all
Yeah.
excited again and can get going. There's like the law of 3 and law of 7. We've got the octaves or the shocks that come in and stop you for a while, and then I find
Yes.
something else that gets me going again, and it's like, oh yes, this is why I was on this path.
Yeah. So I think he's very much emphasizing the kind of the personal way, the individual way. Like that's what he's emphasizing. That the work it's a unique way that you have to. It's the way of the individual. Though there are certain elements in it that that everybody can make use of or needs, but its essence is the individual way. So it's kind of like finding your own way. A way that in your life that corresponds to your sort of your individual needs. So that is going to be like process of discovery, trying to find the little threads that become apparent to you, maybe coincidences, whatever, and following them. Following the breadcrumbs and then trying to, put them together. So he does seem to express it as a kind of individual and unique kind of discovery and creation, that's different to each person. I think that's what he's kind of emphasizing, that you're going to have to get into your own way, find your own way, and that it has to be really, to some degree, unique to you to be real. That there is no set kind of way for everybody.
Well, hopefully this show has inspired people to go back to their Beelzebub's tales to his grandson and reread these parts in Atlantis.
Yeah.
Or even if new people have come to this show, we'll perhaps go and read the book. Because I know it is a hard book to read, and many people say they're in the work but don't actually read the book. But the book is very important.
Yeah, well, I can sympathize with that. It's not like you say, it's not necessarily easy reading, and it, there's content in it that can piss people off. I mean, I myself, I obviously I read the book and I like the teaching, so I like the book. I think it's great, but there's still parts of it, and there's been times where I've wanted to, just throw it in the fire and like to say, what the hell are you talking about? So I think it should be that way. Do you know what I mean? Like I say, I think it's designed that it's supposed to give intense reactions. That if you just reading it, kind of like, yes, Mr. Gurdjieff, yes, Mr. Gurdjieff, oh yes, and just believing it, that I think you're missing something. I think there should be something in you that has an intense reaction both ways, like, wow, yes, but also like an intense, like, no, like he does seem to, on the surface, express a lot of views that people wouldn't be too happy with these days, not PC views. And like, you'll know yourself, some of the things he seems to say about women aren't very, positive, So again, people could look into that, whether he's actually being serious with that or where he's just using that as like an analogy to refer to something else. Again, I think a lot of the slurs against women or the apparent absence of women in his writings is just to express this absence of the subconscious, that side in us. So I think that's why the female is often kind of given a lesser role in these things, and often associated with the cause of trouble, like obviously with Eve, Adam and Eve. But in terms of the forces, you could just think that with the denying nature, it's just the fact that obviously we have a denying nature and it's needed, but that's just what gives rise to conflict, denying and the opposite character of affirming and denying, and that things tend to begin. Well, he says that evolution can only begin with the denying force, can't it? Kind of thing. You have to start, like he talks about the octave developing from the passive dough. You have to start from the passive dough. Otherwise, if you start from the active dough, it could only go downhill. So things have to kind of, you could say, evolution-wise, have to start with the denial, or you could talk about receptivity. So again, that's a lot of why the woman is seen as the origin, but that obviously means that she could be connected with the origin of bad shit, but she's the origin, again, the womb and all, So this idea of the denying force being an origin, but also hazard, coming into that.
I'm glad you said that, because that's one of the bits that I've always found difficult. So it's like, oh right, okay, that sounds really simple now. Get it?
Yeah. I think he's talking about how in our general now, man's subconsciousness, and let's just say that's the female nature. That if we divide it into female and male, that's our kind of female nature, feminine nature, and that's become hidden. and a lot of the religions talk about this, like why, kind of why some of the Eastern and the Muslim women and stuff, why they are covered originally. It's supposed to be symbolic of the kind of the relation of the male and female aspects in ourselves. The feminine is the hidden, it's the covered, So like why obviously apart from the sense of wearing coverings like that in hot countries, there is a sense that if you wear that kind of covering, you can save you from heat exposure and other things. So there is a practical kind of origin to why some of the Muslim women wear that clothes in that environment. But obviously that became exaggerated and misunderstood down the line, and has come to be like a sexual thing and a thing about oppression. But I think it was just like an enactment of the nature of the relationship between the feminine and the male, or the masculine and the feminine. Our subconsciousness, although that side of our nature is hidden, it's veiled.
I like it. I think that's very true. And things well, as he says himself, everything's got a few meanings, so it probably is both of them.
Yeah, well, in like his chapters about religion, he says a lot of these customs, they either started because they had some practical utility, like maybe wearing a covering like that would, help you not get heat exposure, and maybe because you're the woman in the tribe, you're more valued because you're the child bearer, and maybe just in the women's body, maybe there was like more susceptibility to heat, exposure. So maybe that's why they, originally that's why they were supposed to be, clothed. And also then, so if they're not practical considerations in their origin, they're like teaching ones, they're to display something at a deeper level. So
no, it's true. I took the dog out the other week without wearing a hat, and it was very hot, and I got sunstroke that evening. So practical is just as good as the esoteric.
Yeah, well, I just say that a lot of not all of them, but a lot. He said, I think a lot of the cultures that come, the rituals and the practices come from like either a practical or a kind of metaphorical purpose, but obviously they get misunderstood down the generations and turn into like their opposite.
Well, thank you, Josh. It's been great as always, and I've always been intrigued with Atlantis, so it's nice to try and get a bit more of what that was all about out. You still have your WordPress. Can you just give us the website again?
Well, if you type in, it's the Tapestry of Beelzebub's Tales. So I think if you type in that, hopefully you'll find it. Or if you go to WordPress and type that in, you'll find it. Yeah.
And I have my website, debbie-elliott.co.uk. So thank you everybody for watching, listening, or however you're viewing this. And we're going to hopefully come back with another show soon. Thanks again, Josh.
Thank you, Debbie. Yeah. See you all later.